Welcome back. We're now going to make an attack montage for the Raptor. Now, this is going to need some root motion animations. Recall that we have root motion animations set up for our Paladin, and we need root motion animations in order for motion warping to work. And motion warping is what helps our enemy to orient towards us and to actually hit us when it attacks. Otherwise, our enemies are going to be way too boring and easy to kill. Now, if you tried to playtest this after last video, you'll notice that our Paladin is not really able to hit us anymore. You'll see that that weapon goes straight through, and that's because we're not using that old animation blueprint anymore. We're now using the new child blueprint based on our animation blueprint template. So we can go into Paladin and open ABP Paladin. And we have to remember that our attack montage for the Paladin has some anim notifies. If we open our root motion RM Paladin attack, we'll see that we have a couple notifies for enabling and disabling box collision, as well as an attack end that resets the enemy's state so it can attack again. So these anim notifies were implemented in the Paladin animation blueprint, where we're calling blueprint callable functions. So not only do we need to put those back for our new ABP Paladin, we're going to need to implement these once we create our attack montage for the Raptor. So before we forget, we'll go ahead and put these into ABP Paladin here in the event graph. All we have to do is right-click and search for those notifies. We have Enable Box Collision, we have Disable Box Collision, and we have Attack End. Now, what we were doing before was we were getting our enemy variable. So get enemy, we were right-clicking and converting that to a validated get, and from the enemy, we were calling our blueprint callable function set weapon collision enabled. Now, for enable collision, we were setting the collision for our weapon box to query only. And for disable box collision, we were setting it to no collision. So I can copy these two nodes and set it to no collision in the drop down here for disable box collision. And for attack end, we can still get our validated get for the enemy and call our blueprint callable function attack end. Now we're seeing why it's a good idea to give that blueprint callable function the same name as the notify, so it's easy to remember which function to call. So now that those are set up again, we can see that our Paladin should be able to hit us and cause damage. And sure enough, he can. So with all that in mind, it's time to make our attack montage for the Raptor. Now, again, these attacks have to have root motion. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at the animations we have for the Raptor. We're going to go to Paragon Minions, Characters, Buff, Buff Black, Animations. And we have two animations, Bite Attack A and Bite Attack B. And we already took a look at Bite Attack A. Now, this is not a root motion animation, but we can easily turn it into one. Root motion animations are animations in which the root bone moves. So what I'd like to do is duplicate this animation and create a root motion animation. When I change animations, I always like to keep the original. That way, if I mess something up, I can always go back to the original. So I'm going to right-click on Bite Attack A and duplicate it. So selecting Duplicate, and I'm going to call this one RM underscore Raptor Attack 1. And I'll open Raptor Attack 1. And I want this to be a root motion animation. So I'm going to scrub to the very beginning of the animation, go to the skeleton tree and select the root bone and click on plus key to add a key. And I'm also going to scrub through to the end and click on plus key to add a key there. So we can move the root bone somewhere in the middle, and we'll be sure that it starts and ends at the correct central location. So I'm going to scrub through to the point where the Raptor's biting right here. And I'm going to move the root bone forward a bit. So I'm going to select the translation widget and move forward just a bit, and I can see the root bone here stretching out, going forward just a bit. So I'm going to move it to there and add a key. And I'd like to bake this into a new animation. But before I do, I'm going to press play, and we'll see that our animation moves our Raptor forward. And if we scroll down and select Enable Root Motion, we'll see that it doesn't actually work. Because these are keys, it's not baked into the actual animation. If it worked, then checking the checkbox would result in preventing that mesh from moving forward. So that's not going to work. We have to bake this into a new animation. So I like the name Raptor Attack, so I think I'd like to call this just Raptor Attack because it doesn't properly have root motion. But we'll bake this into a new animation that will have root motion. So we can do that by clicking Create Asset, Create Animation, Current Animation, Preview Mesh. And we'll stick this in the same animations folder for Buff Black and call this RM for root motion underscore Raptor Attack 1 and click OK. So now here's our new animation, and if we check Enable Root Motion, the Raptor does not move, at least its root bone stays still. We can uncheck and see it moving forward and check it and see that it doesn't move forward. So we now have a root motion animation for our Raptor. I'd like to do the same thing for Bite Attack B. So I'm going to open it, scrub to the beginning, add a key, scrub to the end and add a key, and right in the middle when there's an attack, I'll move the root bone forward a bit and add a key for that. And we'll bake this into an animation. I know I said that you should duplicate your originals, but we could easily remove these keys. So in this case, I'm just going to bake it into a new animation. So Create Asset, Create Animation, Current Animation, Preview Mesh. And we'll select the animations folder, and I'll call this one RM Raptor Attack 2 and click OK. And now we can press play. We see the root bone moving, and if we check Enable Root Motion, it's not moving. So I'm going to leave it checked for Raptor Attack 1, and I'm going to leave it checked for Raptor Attack 2. So I'm going to double click Raptor Attack 1. Make sure to check Enable Root Motion for 1 and 2. It's very important that root motion is enabled for both of these before we create the montage. Otherwise, root motion and motion warping won't work. So double checking, Enable Root Motion is checked for our new animations, Raptor Attack 1 and 2. So I'm going to save these, and we can now go to work making our montage. I'm going to go ahead and click Save All and make sure everything is saved. And we'll go ahead and we'll make our montage. So we'll go to Blueprints, Enemy, Raptor. And I'm going to make a new folder here and call this Animations. And we'll keep our montages in here so I can make a new montage. So right-click Animation and Animation Montage. And we'll choose our Buff Black skeleton. That's our Raptor skeleton. And we'll call this one RM underscore Raptor Attack. And we'll open this up and we'll get those root motion animations. So we'll search for RM Raptor Attack 1, bring that in, and RM Raptor Attack 2. And we need montage sections. So I'm going to select the default section, and up here in the details panel, I'm going to rename it to Attack 1. And I'll make a new montage section, right-click, New Montage Section. I'll call this one Attack 2 and move it right here to RM Raptor Attack 2. And I'll select my Montage Sections tab and clear this out. So I'll click Clear there, and now we have 2 montage sections. And we need those notifies here. Now, we don't have any notifies for this skeleton. Notifies are per skeleton. So we need to add some notifies. And I can expand the drop-down under Notifies, and I'm just going to rename the first one Enable Box Collision. And I'll go ahead and add a new notify track called Disable Box Collision. And I'll make another track and call this one Attack End, and yet another track and call this one Warp Translation. I'm not sure if that's what I called it in our Paladin attack. I think I called it Translation Warping, and the other one Rotation Warping. Well, just to be consistent, I'll call it Translation Warping. and we'll add yet another track and call this one rotation warping. So now we have spots for our notifies, and we can even add more for sounds and things. Now we need to enable box collision, right? So I'm going to scrub through in the first attack, and I'd like to start enabling box collision about here. So we'll right-click in Enable Box Collisions track, add notify, and if we look for skeleton notifies, well, we haven't created anyone for this skeleton. That's why they're called skeleton notifies. They're per skeleton. So we have to create a new notify, and we'll call this Enable Box Collision. And I'll scrub through to about there, just after the attack, right? Just about there, and we'll disable box collision here. So add notify, new notify, and we'll call this one disable box collision. And finally, at the very end of the attack, we need the attack end notify. So we'll right-click, add notify, new notify, and call this one attack end. And we need these three notifies in attack 2 as well. So I can simply highlight the three of them, Control C, and scrub through till about where I want to enable collision for the second attack. I think I'll enable it right here. Right there. I'll enable it there and disable it there. And we have our attack end. Now for motion warping. Right? So where do we want to motion warp? Well, I'd like to motion warp just up to the attack. So basically the first part of the animation. So we'll right-click under Translation Warping, add Notify State, and this time choose Motion Warping. And I'll scroll in and take the second part of the handle, the end of the handle, and hold Shift and scrub through until I'm just about at that attack. I want to go up to about here and warp from just about the beginning. And we need to set up this motion warping notify state. So in the details panel for root motion modifier, we can select skew warp like we did for the paladin and open the drop down for root motion modifier and choose the warp target name. Now let's remind ourselves what we called this. We'll go to the paladin, select its notify state for translation warping, and we'll see under root motion modifier, it's called translation target. I'm going to copy it so I don't risk typing this wrong and paste it here for warp target name. Now this is the translation warping, so we don't want to warp rotation. We're going to uncheck warp rotation here. And we'll have another notify state specifically for rotation. So I'm going to control mouse wheel to zoom in, add notify state, choose motion warping, and select this one. And for root motion modifier, we'll use skew warp again. And this one will be rotation target. And I'm going to take it from this other notify state in the paladin, copy it there, and come back and paste it for the warp target name. And this time we don't want to warp translation. We want to warp rotation, and we want to set the rotation type to facing. That way, our enemy will face us every time it warps to us. And I'll go ahead and scroll out and motion warp the rotation up to just before the attack, so right there. And we can copy these two notify states and put them at the beginning of attack 2. So I'm going to go ahead and copy these, scrub through to attack 2, paste them in, and it looks like they went up here, so I'm going to drop them down into their correct sections. And I just want to make sure that we're warping correctly. So I want to warp to just up to the attack here. So right about there is where we'll warp. So now we have an attack montage. So we can save this, and we need to set this in BP Raptor. So selecting BP Raptor Self, here in the combat section, we have an attack